Aujourd'hui très heureux d'accueillir Michael Renner. Michael Renner a fait ses études à Bâle. Bâle est, je pense pour la plupart de vous aussi une école qui est connue au moins par les différents ouvrages qui sont sortis, qui étaient faits par des enseignants de cette époque, qui a fait une grande partie aussi de l'historique du design graphique en Suisse. C'était Armin Hofmann, Emil Ruder et plus tard Wolfgang Weingart. Et Michael court après ses études, il part pour les États-Unis. On est fin des années 80, début des années 90, travaille avec Apple. Et c'est aussi un moment crucial dans l'histoire parce que c'est à ce moment-là où l'ordinateur personnel est devenu vraiment un outil extrêmement important avec et pour notre profession. Et c'était un moment clé, plein de choses à découvrir, à nouveau réécrire. Et avec cette expérience et ce bagage, Michael est revenu. Il partage aujourd'hui son temps entre l'enseignement, la recherche et aussi la méthodologie de transmission des connaissances. Il dirige en fait l'école de design de Bâle aujourd'hui et il est aussi professeur invité à l'université Illinois à Chicago. Bon, alors, merci d'être venu. Les mots sont à Michael.
Merci André. Bonsoir mesdames, messieurs. Bonsoir à tous. J'aurais préféré vous parler ce soir en français, mais mes 8 années de cours de français au lycée se sont énouies. What a beautiful word. Et je vais devoir faire ma présentation sur ce sujet délicat en anglais. Thank you, Philippe Millot et André Baldinger, Centre culturel suisse et INSAT, for inviting me and giving the speakers a challenging task with the title of this series. I will try to relate my contribution to the framework you have given under the title Déséquilibre of the Aesthetic Experience. As Swiss graphic designers, we encounter the image one has about Switzerland as soon as we go abroad. Swiss graphic design is until today mainly by many people reduced to black and white, grid-based typography, sans serif typefaces, mainly Helvetica, maybe some geometric shapes or black and white photography, maybe one additional color to highlight a part of the message. Even so, we relate to the tradition of Swiss graphic design at my institute, at the Basel Academy of Art and Design. The described formula has become repetitive and therefore outdated for us since the 1970s, the time before I have received my education. My most recent encounter with the cliché of Swiss design has been the collaboration with a curatorial team in Chengdu, China. Oops, sorry. I actually wanted to let that run, but I don't see it here. We opened in December an exhibition presenting the history of and the current activities of the Institute for Digital Communication Environments, IDCE, in a series of events in China under the title Graphic at China, Swiss Graphic at China. It is needless to say that it took some time that our Chinese colleagues understood that Helvetica is good, but not enough. But how can we describe a true image of Switzerland, Swiss graphic design, or any cultural context? I propose to draw an image of Switzerland and its visual communication through the close reading of aesthetic deviations. In order to follow this approach, we need to have a short look at what we call an aesthetic experience. The harmonious interaction of the living being with the environment is considered as the foundation for an aesthetic experience by pragmatist thinkers. John Dewey compares the aesthetic experience in the context of art metaphorically with a stone rolling down a hill. The stone leaves its equilibrium, accelerates, slows down, is deviated by obstacles, and encounters, if it would be a living being, various situations on its downhill journey until it finally comes to a rest again. It is clear that the stone will come to a rest already in the beginning of the journey, but it is not predictable precisely when and where. The harmonious situation is achieved at the end when the stone comes to rest in the environment, but before that, an unbalanced situation is the cause for the aesthetic experience unfolding over a period of time. If there is no process over time in opposition to the aesthetic experience of perception, Dewey describes the act of recognition when a label is attached and he says no stir of the organism, no inner commotion is triggered. This distinction between the aesthetic experience and recognition is crucial for visual communication. On one hand, communication is bound to provide recognizable meaning in what is presented to a beholder. On the other hand, it is the aesthetic experience which binds attention and distinguishes the viewing of successful objects of visual communication from the flow of experiences we encounter and filter out continuously as living beings. In his account of the graphic artist, Jean-François Lyotard describes the necessity of a visual message to be intriguing, surprising, and convincing in order to capture the attention of the passerby. The deviation of the visual message from what we store in our collective visual memory is key to create an intriguing effect, or what we have called an aesthetic experience before. Lyotard describes to the point that the effect of an object of visual communication, a poster, a book, a typeface, an interface, can only be evaluated in a historical context, at the time of its creation and its dissemination. Only when the poster is visible in the street, we can understand its deviation from what everybody has seen before and can experience its intriguing, surprising, or convincing effect. The visual communication designer and the artist, as Lyotard describes, are both concerned with developing a deviation from what we have seen before. In opposition to the continuous search for the deviation of the already seen by the visual communication designer, he describes mechanisms of propaganda. According to him, the employment of known mechanisms to bind attention is characteristic for propaganda. Based on this short and incomplete summary of the aesthetic discourse, I would like to share in the following section some of my attempts to create this equilibrium in my practice. After a brief historical review of the search of objectivity in graphic design in the middle of the 20th century, I will address questions of how the creation of the aesthetic disequilibrium can be taught or approached in research. I would like to emphasize that what I show you tonight are attempts which trigger, ideally, processes we can call aesthetic experiences in the beholder. They are comparable in hindsight, rather as groping in the dark, in reference to the memoirs of the blind, that strategically directed attempts to produce an intriguing experience for the beholder. Since these humble attempts of deviation can only be a reaction on what exists at the time in Switzerland in order to be understood as communicative objects, the presented examples may allow to infer aspects of an indirect description of the context at the time. Even as an experienced designer, when I really go beyond my comfort zone and leave what I know, how it is perceived behind, I feel sometimes like on my first day of kindergarten. We were given scissors and color paper and had the task to make an image of a cherry tree. I will never forget what discussion the one black cherry on my collage of the cherry tree caused between the kindergarten teacher and my mother. The former saw the dark cherry as a clear indicator of a troubled psyche, which made its way onto the tree. It was the time when the test of the Swiss psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach and also graphological evaluations were popular for the discovery of hidden forces behind one's actions. With my studies in graphic design at the former Basel School of Design from 1981 to 1986, I learned to avoid unpredictable reactions. The craft of representing objects through graphic translation in black and white is a skill which deviated hardly from what we have seen, but it can be intriguing by its excellence of execution. How is it possible to show the three-dimensional space, materiality, and atmosphere through the reduction to one printing color? Already during my studies, the emergence of digital technology in the form of the personal computer promised new possibilities of extending the aesthetic experience. But the teapot on the right, which I drew at Apple in 1986, in Cupertino, in an alpha version of what we know today as Illustrator, was called Picasso, does not show any novelty in comparison to the teacup realized with black and white placa using brushes on cardboard. Also, the many pictograms, maps, and layouts we have developed in early vector programs for the Pacific Bell telephone books could have been done with analog means. It was the time when the software developed rapidly and every new release seemed to enable the designer to influence the visual message in new ways. With the pre-release of a software version, one could create visual messages which appeared novel until the official release of the software enabled everyone around the world to use the same effect. It was new that the source of the image became blurred. It was possible to create images which looked photographic but were rendered, and close and interwoven relationships between typography, photographic, graphic, or rendered elements became easily available. The redundancy of the reduction to the max was overcome by a step towards serious complexity. So these posters were done from 1991 to 1995. I remember very well, it was hardly possible an A2 format to process digitally. On the left-hand side, only the half photographic image in an A3 was possible, and of course at the end of it was not a question anymore. At the same time, with the digital development, it became possible for designers to write applications in order to enable an audience to interact with the computer. Deviations from the normative interface was already at stake in these early authoring programs. You see here experimental possibilities of what could buttons do except for just opening another window. In a drawing application, I was developing in 1990 for the Basel Design Museum to be used in an exhibition about pictograms. The power of participation became apparent. Even though the screen was only 9 inches in diameter, the resolution coarse and the tools we provided limited, the 3 computers were constantly in use, since it allowed, beyond drawing, also printing the visualization of the chosen term and the comparison with visualization attempts from other visitors of the exhibition. And in the background, of course, we were able to save these drawings and visualizations, and it became very interesting to see which terms are introduced and standardized in a very clear way. Poison, gift in German, always the skull and crossbones, while psychotherapy, a wide range of visualizations which were not really coined as one sign. As we can see in technical developments, often the appearance of the new fosters also an intensive exploration of the old. The digital has also sparked in my work the exploration of the processes of putting ink on paper. Transparency of the silkscreen ink can be adjusted in a very fine gradation and has a completely different effect in comparison to the digital imitation of transparency. Here in a poster for the Basel destination marketing for a photo competition they organized. Or also another aspect of materiality in printing, offset prints can achieve with metallic effect, lose its complete transparency through the addition of silver, gold, or copper. So you see here this application, which is actually very difficult to show digitally again. That's why I have those things also here in paper. It is, of course, again, very hard to follow what is the difference between the screen and this, but you should have a look afterwards at these possibilities. And overprinting a toned paper with white silkscreen ink created a deviation from the use through a haptic quality. And split fountain silkscreen processes have been a deviation until recently, until everybody used it. With the further development of authoring software and their script languages, new forms of interaction became possible. Especially intriguing were interfaces with elements which behaved like objects of the real world and displayed a quality of a living being. So you see here some coding experiments from 20 years ago. We do still similar things with other technology. And you see also here explorations of how could we really view a video sequence in this medium in a different way. What happens if we are always viewing several pictures of a sequence and can manipulate them in very different ways, as you see here in this experiment here, also can change the speed of a sequence depending on placing one of the frames in a certain way, or how can we actually create a rhythm of a sequence through possibilities you see here in this experiment. There were many more, but I think that gives you a short insight into these possibilities. 2001, 1999, object possibility to look at interfaces, thesis project from Roland John on the history of the personal computer and the development of this technology. We see experimentation, how could we access this information in a different way than just clicking on the next button to get to the next screen and so forth. And of course, also outside of the educational frame, we did some experiments and also applications, of course, for the Louis-Barragan exhibition at the Vita Design Museum, also for the Fountain exhibition. It was, of course, the big question, how can we use this technology in a way which makes sense? So for the Barragan exhibition, there are a lot of photos existing from famous photographers related to those buildings. How can you show them in an exhibition? And you see here a very simple possibility. In the floor plans, you can access a lot of those views of the building in this small publication. Since Swiss graphic design and digital interfaces are mostly serious and functional, a loophole for deviation of the norm and therefore for aesthetic experience can be found in irony. I'll show you some examples. On the left-hand side, exhibition on religious motives in advertising. On the right-hand side, a thesis exhibition of an institution which just became university level, so with a very cheap connotation of this language. Switzerland, the country of precise typography with typography which negative space is missing in the R, and also the numbers are kind of in the wrong place. And of course, the core of Swiss design, the poster, conference, and also an exhibition on Weltformat, that's the Swiss poster size, used kind of overriding the cliché which I have described before. And maybe another category of deviations, even though it's old and deeply reflected upon the subject of the relationship between language and images, reading and seeing, unexpected deviations can occur. So how is the letter form designed? How are the other elements interacting with it? A lot of writing has been done in reflection on that. On notational iconicity by Sibylle Krämer and other people. And of course also this kind of lettering, bringing together the seeing and the reading in these kind of possibilities is always still an interesting possibility to find deviations. Also in a sense of layout typography, where graphic elements interact in an unexpected way with text. It is needless to say that the frivolous use of color is a deviation and possibly an aesthetic riddle for beholders used to black and white. So I show you some of those examples. Most of them use these split fountain possibilities in silk screen, and you see also some examples here in front, which of course again are different than what you see on the screen. A series of small posters for a science slam, and also the possibility of a very little thing, Christmas cards, which was a series of wrapped cards which people got over years and started collecting, and one of them used also this kind of very intense colors. So to summarize, I would just like to show you some visualizations we have done in our academy, where the expression is, of course, about education of these deviations. So how can you show creativity, that you're an institution of creativity? I'm sure you have the same problem here. We moved to a new campus in 2014, and which is actually a cultural hub with other institutions, collections, exhibition rooms around us, which with the center is our Academy of Art and Design Basel. And of course you need the signage system, and you see here an example of this signage system, which actually should reproduce over time a history, so we don't really take everything away, but we override it in this way, as you see it here. And in the meantime, a lot of these situations after 8 years at the time can be found by the opening campaign of the campus. There were 3 photographs with actors and performers using these empty rooms, and we used them for a year with different imprints. You see here in a preview, you see here other events of that year, and you see here an outside situation with those posters. And some other posters in the meantime developed around that campus, and of course much more around it. Initiatives on sustainability, small exhibition about it, conference, and also publication around it. And again, materiality, a giveaway from our ceramics workshop, which was developed inside the academy and is part of that whole image. So I hope these examples of a presented aesthetic disequilibria have drawn, at least indirectly, an image which is more accurate than the cliché one has or may people have about Swiss visual communication. I don't claim that the examples draw a comprehensive image, but put some spotlights in the dark. But what was the foundation we have started from in order to achieve an aesthetic deviation? Let's turn to history of Swiss graphic design in the middle of the 20th century briefly. When looking at historical examples of aesthetic disequilibria in the search of objectivity. So you know probably all of those major protagonists, or at least 2 or 3 of them. Little is known about the debates of the protagonists in the middle of the 20th century, but behind the above described cliché, we find a variety of opinions regarding the creative process, the role of visual communication, as well as the principles of education by those who were instrumental in creating a Swiss style. Especially the role of drawing and illustration was heavily contested. Joseph Müller-Brockmann wrote in his publication, The Graphic Artist and His Problem, 1961, the author, Joseph Müller-Brockmann, too began with illustration, and after a great deal of experience and thought, changed over to objective graphic art. He abandoned illustration because he realized that the illustrative solution never quite serves the purpose of the work in hand. The more anonymous and objective these elements are, the more suitable they prove as a vehicle for the thematic idea. In contrast to this position, Kurt Wirth, in his publication also from 1961, Drawing When and How, writes, in contrast of this drawn form is form which completely excludes momentary chance. Constructible form is attained through planning. The values inherent in the ductus of the line are replaced by the objective precision of the statement. So these are kind of the strong oppositions, and you see it also in their work. On the left-hand side, geometry, raster-based, and on the top right, Kurt Wirth never really left the drawing also as a result. And somewhat in between, our former colleagues from Basel. So Armin Hoffmann writes in his design manual, which you also quote, I think, in your description of the lecture series, it is only in drawing which occupies an isolated and underprivileged position in the curriculum that thinking, inventing, representing, transposing, and abstracting can be correlated. And Ruder, who was the typographer in the middle of the 20th century in Basel, our sensibility, that is our visual perception and our aesthetic sense, is superior of geometric construction, and it is in this sensibility that we must appeal when striking a balance between opposed black and white. So these are the kind of three positions we have, sorry, I have not shown you that, which we have, and they were also very closely connected to educational ideas. Müller-Brockmann supposedly taught in Zurich, but if you look precisely, for 2 years. And then he left and went to Ulm. You are at the street of Ulm, and he fit perfectly in there. In the Ulm philosophy, where the intuition was the devil. This was the bad thing which brought ideology. Eicher should have supposedly said that drawing and painting is for the weekend. And Kurt Wirth is kind of the opposite. He thinks drawing is still like the most authentic way of expression. And in Basel, you will see it, drawing was the center of the education, but the result was not really drawn anymore. So along with these opposite positions came also opposite ideas regarding the education of graphic designers. So let's look at teaching objectivity in the middle of the 20th century. At the center at the center of drawing, of the education of a graphic designer, was drawing in Basel, but it was a drawing which only things you could talk about objectively were taught. So the representation of space, how much you see in top of this ellipse, is that correct? Is that really how we understand space in the Western world? So this was very strong. Another aspect of the education was learning a design process. At that time, it was called graphic. Horrified black square. You had a black square, 8 centimeters long, and you were supposed to make an action with this square. Fold it, rip it, cut it, fold it over again. And then you had to place this black square on a white square, and you had to be able to prove that it was originally a square. So this was, you had to find out criteria, how many original length sides you have to show, how many corners of 90 degrees you have to show. So you would get solutions down here. These are solutions after the second and the third. These are solutions. Then you would take one and figure out the principle how it was done. You would make correlations with that, and afterwards you would make, you would place them in a grid, and you would make the steps in between, and you would have the overview of all the possibilities which you would have. Very good to learn, but probably not very innovative what comes out ever, which is maybe the misconception of it, but it was an interesting tool for planning, actually, and to learn how to systematically look for variations. And of course, there were exercises like applied semiotics. What is the form? What is triggered when we show the snake around the apple? Switzerland, the arrow going through the apple, Wilhelmtell, and so forth. So the attempt to find out and to objectify how things work. And even in the drawing class, every drawing was slightly different, even so the ellipses were all right, maybe. But everybody had its individual way to use the brush and or the tools, especially because the drawings were really large. So the gesture actually was very important, but not in a way that Okay, thank you. Not in a way that it was talked about. So you would never talk about an individuality of a drawing. This was not at stake. And of course, this also came to an end in the 70s with people who were also questioning this so-called approach to objectivity. With Wolfgang Weingart, who had a completely different approach to teach and to work also, of course, in his own work. So, the teaching model of the Basel School in the middle of the 20th century, presented before, did only address what we can talk about objectively. Sometimes something is more or less readable, something is more or less accurate to our visual convention of representing three-dimensional space, a color combination is harmonious, and so forth. It went along with the idea that an eternal valid aesthetic solution exists to a visual problem. It was not reflected that visual communication is part of a cultural development and is therefore dependent on social, political, technological change and cultural context. These seemingly neutral, culturally independent characteristics of Swiss graphic design is until today its advantage and also the reason for its misconception. So I would like to show some projects we do today. We still do basic experiences, but they look different. We have, for example, what we call digital culture, coding classes. Here, a library, Basel.js, which was produced by some of our colleagues, Ted Davis and Ludwig Zeller in our institute, where you can access large amounts of data and create visualizations in InDesign or also publications in InDesign. So it's kind of this mix between analog book development and also moving graphics, as you have seen, and visualizations. We do have also physical. So in a context of drawing, of course, it's interesting to see what can the machine do and what do we do with our gestures. And of course, there is also typography and there are other classes in drawing, which I will show afterwards, but sometimes also with very different goals. So if we look, for example, at drawing, we still draw on very large format sheets of paper. But we have another goal with drawing. It is not the goal of the drawing class to reach virtuosity in analytical drawing, but to understand drawing as a model of a design process. The inquiry into this process reveals the individuality of a student's gesture and approach. It reveals preconceptions of the use of tools and what a good drawing might be. It reveals the cultural influences and the individual deviations. So one example we do is, for example, in an afternoon, we have the students draw compositions they like with straight lines. You see here possibilities. After an hour, we ask the students to pick two which they really like the best, to mark them, and we lay them out. And after a break, we ask the students to draw flowers or pumpkins, and also after about an hour to pick the two they prefer. And of course, if you look at these examples, you see completely different approaches, especially if it's a culturally mixed group of students. They have a completely different access to the tool and the idea of what they have to do when they have to draw something which they like. So you see an example here on the bottom, someone who is really afraid to not be able to explain what he or she is doing. So to follow a principle of saying, yes, it's kind of the golden section or large contest, big and small, in comparison to a student in the top, which is dares to make a line and continue freely from something like that. Yeah, and you see, of course, someone who is able to work with accidents of using color, letting things bleed, or someone who is using the brush in a completely different way on the bottom. And you see a Swiss person who likes also to do something very structural. I take the brush and then I see how long it takes, so I can also explain what it is, or a very analytical approach to it. So it's not to say something is good or is bad, but it's to reflect also in a group what are the things we are drawn to, and we do automatically without being even aware of it. And of course, the gesture is something which other people have called the most individual thing next to the voice. Hannah Arendt has said that, and we are not aware of our own gestures, but the other people see it. So it is, of course, a possibility to address influences from a cultural background, but also our own individuality. We do the same things with writing. We learn how to write properly. We know how the handwriting has to be in order to be read, how it can be a scribble to remember something, and how it can be an expression of the writer's mode or emotion. Even if the letters are not anymore readable, we know how a signature developed through repetition and how the signature still counts as a proof of identity and presence. Changing the tool or pretending to write. And maybe one more small example. We draw with different possibilities, blindfolded, and of course with long sticks. And it's always surprising to many people that even if you have not much control over your marks, it very often gets better than if you really are controlling every detail. So one thing to figure that out is speed drawing. So 10 seconds, try to draw an object, then increase the time, a minute, 10 minutes, as long as you need. And going back to the 10 seconds. And of course, in many cases, you see a huge change between the first 10 seconds and the last one. So yeah, it shows us, of course, that our hand thinks with us and learns something, and that the essence of representation can be improved or addressed also in these possibilities. But basic experiences are not an end in itself. They serve as a foundation to solve more complex problems of communication. Just two examples as illustrations of what we may call a reflected practice, addressing issues of concern. So I would like to show a thesis project from 22. It's a Romanian student. She was very impressed about all the little workshops you can access in Switzerland for free, in ceramics and printmaking, very small, funky places. And she had the goal to make them more accessible and that they communicate in a different way. And of course, they don't want to be under an umbrella brand or something like this. So you see here some of the examples she proposed of a flag they could hang outside their workshops, that people see that something is going on inside. Our thesis projects usually comprise a written thesis, a practical thesis, and also a process documentation. And you see here a small part of the process documentation. And the practical outcome was also presented in this kind of magazine-like small printed overview of what she suggests: a flag, an app where you can schedule time, and also, of course, an internet website, which she proposed for the communication of these workshops. Another example, reflected practice addressing issues of concern, was an elective class we conducted last year for the My Climate initiative of the Basel airport. And we all know the apocalyptic images of sustainability of our future, when the temperature will rise, burning forests, floods, extreme weathers, and so forth. I don't have to repeat it. So My Climate tries to get people to compensate or pay compensation of CO2 exhaust when you're flying. And the students would develop different visualizations of the facts. You see here different destinations which are presented and how much exhaust you actually have. You see here on the pillars also temperatures and how much the water will be rise with which temperature. You see the proposal of imaginary travel with a flying carpet, and you see a proposal here to show a future which is attainable in a sense of a positive future of a nature which is still existing and strong. Or you see also an example here in place and executed, as the other ones are as well, of hands and environment in a very abstract way, to care about our environment in a different way than we have done it. And you see the indication on the right to sign up for this climate initiative, My Climate. So if we look back at the shift happening from 1950s to today, we may as well use Bruno Latour's observation regarding the shift from modernity to today. He describes this shift as the change from matters of fact to matters of concern. This applies for the shift from analytical drawing to drawing as a means to inquire into the forces influencing our intuitive decisions. It also applies to the aim to do research in the context of art and design. If we are concerned about something, we want to know more about it and differentiate the topic. It has been a major effort in Swiss universities of art and design over the past 2 decades to invent research for the design and arts disciplines, as it probably is also here. These efforts have been supported by the Swiss National Science Foundation, which provides research grants to qualified applications from the field of design and art, as for any other academic discipline. In the context of the National Center of Competence in Iconic Research at the University of Basel, we have participated in the so-called alphabetization, in quotes, of the image with disciplines of the humanities and the sciences. Our unique contribution in this context, which we call today practice-led image, media, and communication research, is based on the generating of images or media applications in order to differentiate their processes of creating meaning. Just a quick look at 2 examples developed on the student level. So I show you a project which won actually last year the Federal Design Prize in the category of research from Claudia Colombo on latent images. It's a project from 2 years ago already. And she looked at deep learning possibilities to generate images. It has rapidly changed already until today. It was the state of the art at this time. So again, that relationship between language and images, we trigger in those applications with words, which images are used statistically to create a specific new term. So you see on the middle here the term passion and different possibilities which come out when you use these deep learning softwares. At that time, the images were not really readable for us. They just kind of gave an atmosphere, but you could use these images again for a visual search, and you would get those images on the bottom left in that spread on passion. You see here an example of pride, and you see in this presentation where she goes through the whole book, other examples she has looked at. So we have, again, the example of passion. We will have the next term of love. And of course, latent images, sleeping images. What she tried to show and was able to show is who is feeding those databases and what is actually a preconception of those databases if we show love like that. If we show passion as we have seen it before, how if we show affection in the next example. So the biases these images carry on. So this is affection, black and white. And so forth. You can look at all of those videos also on our website. And maybe a completely different approach. Again, relationship somehow between language and images, project also from 2 years ago, from Auschwitz on poetic narration. She wanted to draw and she wanted to develop a poetic narration, which she wrote and drew herself, and played with images which come up in your head when you read a word, when you read language, and how it can be contradicted, overcome, or extended through visual possibilities. Also, a long video, which we cannot see the whole thing, but I just...
Que vois-tu?
Finally in French. The ellipse is not right.
Le verre d'eau à moitié vide. Le bois-tu? Non, j'y nage. Car l'effort empêche de remettre quoi que ce soit en question. À moins d'être sportif et de pouvoir penser. À quoi? Cours! Après quoi? Le bus, souvent. Mais d'habitude, j'attends. Éternellement. Comme lorsque tu regardes péniblement les dernières secondes qui s'écoulent sur l'écran du micro-ondes.
Okay, and so forth. Of course, we do also research on a faculty level with involvement from PhD students. I'm not going into the details here. That would be 2 other talks or more. But I would like to show you some projects, some images from projects we have done regarding participation in or visual communication in participatory processes of urban planning. So we have worked with anthropologists together, and we looked how images actually and the generation of images fosters mutual understanding in those processes which very often leads to a dead end, where the planning office proposes something and the whole population is opposed against it. So we looked at possibilities to work in these processes with images, creating images, but also with proposing other ways to use images for visualization in those processes. As I said, it's a whole other topic which would be interesting to look at, but I don't think that makes sense right now. But it is needless to say that the faculty and PhD research has a strong influence on the content of the classes and the students' projects as well. So let me conclude. We have started out with the observation that the aesthetic experience is a timely process which meanders between understanding and imagining, as already Immanuel Kant has stated. Also, John Dewey has addressed imagination as key part of the aesthetic experience, but has described imagination as an internal negotiation between what we are familiar with, the old, and what we perceive as new and unfamiliar. I have shown how the attempts of deviating from the familiar can look like in the context of practice, teaching, and research. Through this individual negotiation in the process of imagination, a mutual understanding can be fostered in a group, and a plurivocal message can be developed in order to avoid polarization and the restriction to one worldview. In this sense, I hope we continue to develop this equilibria of aesthetic experiences in applied and fine arts in continuousness, that we make only small in consciousness, that we make only small steps beyond where we come from. It is a precise, this equilibrium If it is a precise disequilibrium, I don't know. It is the complex precision of intuitive groping in the dark, in which all our conditional mechanisms are showing their influence and individuality. I guess Hoffmann, Fischli-Weiss, and Musil, and many of you are or were well aware of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. So if you have questions, interrogations, that's the moment. But I think I have only this microphone with a reduced connection, so you have to speak loud. Any questions, remarks? Or the idea of the Swiss is completely head down, head up, and left and right. Okay, but then just say, have a look on the posters. We have a glass outside, so you can please have a drink, and you can also talk directly to Michael outside. Okay, thank you very much.